Colditz Castle, deep in the heart of Germany.
Order to discourage any further foolish...
Once a prisoner was inside, the Nazis thought escape was impossible.
Decided to withdraw...
But for the Allied men imprisoned here, their ingenuity in attempting to escape knew no bounds. Colditz would not get the better of them.
Special announcement.
I felt that if I had to be locked up, which I obviously didn't want to be, I couldn't have thought of a better lot of blokes to be locked up with, because every single one of them, they wanted to escape.
They tried everything from tunneling to simple disguise, hiding in lorries, to leaping over walls. It was their duty to escape.
Every day, there were people in Colditz doing something towards escape.
For 4 years, the Allied bad boys were held here in grim, inhospitable circumstances.
I feel that a lot of the stories that are written and films show it as all rather jolly. It was not. I don't think they show the awful misery and strain of it.
This is the story of Colditz. In 1955, and the film The Colditz Story is released in British cinemas. Directed by Guy Hamilton and starring John Mills, it was based on a book written by Pat Reid, who had himself escaped from Colditz some 13 years earlier.
Our mother made him write the book. There were 10 years almost between his escape and the book coming out. He let that delay happen so that others could publish books if they wanted to. Nobody had. He felt it was his duty to write the story of Colditz, because otherwise it would have remained untold.
Today, Colditz Castle looks picturesque, quaint even. But during the Second World War, it was a place of last resort for the Allies' perpetual escapers.
Well, it was a castle, smack in the middle of the Third Reich, probably the furthest distance from any neutral country. And it just looked the ideal place for the Germans to decide to put their rotten eggs.
These rotten eggs were Allied soldiers who had been caught trying to make their way back to Britain across a Europe that was swarming with advancing Nazi troops. Capture seemed inevitable, and among those picked up was Commando Coron Purden, who was on the run from Spangenberg prisoner of war camp.
Dick and I were then caught in a tunnel. Unfortunately, we were actually caught in it. And so we were then sent for by Hauptmann Roth, who was the commandant there, who was a pretty straight chap, actually. I mean, I gather he'd had his son killed on the Ostfront, but there was no... he wasn't a shouty sort of fellow. And actually, he said to me, "I must congratulate you on your escape." But he said, I know that you're going to go on trying to escape. And also, you're Deutschfeindlich, you hate the Germans. And I said, well, right on both of those, yes. And so he said, right, well, I'm going to send you to the Straflager. And he said, that's Flag 4C at Colditz. I had heard about that, you know, anyway. So he said, the camp for the bad boys. And I said, okie doke.
June 1940, and the war was turning in Germany's favour, with the spectre of fascism looming over Britain. As the Allies did all they could to stop the advance, more and more of their soldiers and airmen were being captured and held as prisoners of war in Germany. This was a consequence of the retreat to Dunkirk, which left men stranded on the beaches and behind enemy lines. Not only this, but aircraft were being shot down and crews bailing out during ever more intensive raids over targets deeper in the heart of Germany. Soon, German prisoner of war camps were overflowing with Allied prisoners of war. These prisoners were desperate to get home. With Britain under threat, they felt helpless, hundreds of miles away. They missed their families. They missed their homes. And they wanted to contribute to the war effort. Instead, they were stuck in Germany. And the real nuisance prisoners, with their thoughts firmly on escape, were holed up in Colditz, in the heart of the Third Reich.
Well, we got out of a train, it was dark, with the guards, and there were the lights of the town, but floating up in the sky was this enormous castle, which was floodlit, and it looked as if it was suspended up there in darkness. It was very effective. And it was funny because little Brucey and I looked up at this thing, thought, my God, what's that? And the guards saw us doing it, and they said, yeah, that's where you're going.
Well, we got to Colditz Station, and we walked across this bridge, and that's when I heard the cheering and the noise. And I could see this huge castle, you know, and the bars on the windows where we realized the prisoners were. And then we went in through the entrance to the place and then into the courtyard, which was cobbled. And the far wall, all the windows were barred. And underneath there were the tables, which had been put there by the Germans. And they were obviously going to deal with our documentation.
We were marched up to this thing. When we got there, enormous gates opening, big solid doors with iron bound, this, that, and the other on it. It made me think of that old saying, abandon hope, all ye who enter here, you know. It was pretty grim. And I think I said to Brucey, we'll get out of this bloody place too. And he said, yes, but our voices are a little bit shaky, I think.
Achtung, zwei Posten.
Straight away, the new arrivals realized this was no ordinary prison camp.
Everywhere you looked, you either got sentries on, you see. Everywhere seemed to be covered by sentries. And you had searchlights on all night on the windows. That's the same in Spangenberg. I mean, you never had a night where you had darkness to go to sleep in, unless there was an RAF or American air raid. If you had an air raid, they turned off the searchlights. But otherwise, you had the searchlights on. And really, you looked out and you seemed to see there'd either be a chap with a rifle sort of walking up and down, or there'd be a sort of little place with a machine gun in it, trained on parts of where the prisoners were.
Well, the first thing is there were more Germans than prisoners. There's a thing that was remarked upon by Hauptmann Eggers, the escaped the security officer there. That was the main thing. It was supposed to be an escape-proof castle, and the Wehrmacht intended it should be so. By the time I got there, it jolly nearly was.
Die Akten der zwei englischen Gefangenen. Geht in Ordnung? Mitkommen!
But the Germans underestimated the determination of the prisoners to escape. And they also made two crucial mistakes in the choice of Colditz Castle and its use as a maximum security prison for perpetual escapers.
What a bloody silly idea to push so many people who wanted to escape together, because you learned from each other, you know, and each new chap came in, he would be grilled on how he did it and what he saw and, you know, and what were the snags and so on. So it really, in a way, you might call it an escape academy, you know.
You've got to remember that a castle is built to keep people from getting in. And you could argue that it was a mistake by the Germans in some ways, because Stallelov 3 was purpose-built, whereas this was just an old castle, and the Germans spent a lot of money and a lot of time and effort in trying to make it escape-proof.
Immediately, thoughts turned to escape. And when the Poles introduced themselves by picking locks, the British knew they had found a valuable ally.
Starzyński, rotmistrz Ulanów Poznańskich.
Sikorski, porucznik Ulanów Śląskich.
When the British first arrived there, the Poles were already in the camp. And, of course, we'd gone to war because of the invasion of Poland. So there was at that time an extraordinary respect by the Poles for the British. And the Poles had already worked out how the camp worked. They'd already begun to try and escape. And a great rapport developed between the British and the Poles in the early part of the war.
The Poles, I mean, and they were frightfully smart, you know, on parade and so on. I mean, they were very smart. We were a complete bloody shambles on parade. I mean, unless it was the Queen's or the King's birthday and so on, when we all, you know, smartened up and did a bloody good parade. But the Poles were grand, and they were a bloody brave lot.
Yes, I thought they were extremely brave people. I admired the Poles tremendously. Really super chaps.
With Hitler's army advancing through Europe, and with Britain firmly in his sights, those in Colditz were desperate to escape and rejoin the war effort.
You can't tell until you get in and you see all the routines, and then you put your escaper's mind to it. But it was very, very much more difficult, I found, because there were a number of nationalities in there. There were the British, the French, Belgians, Dutch officers, and they had started off earlier on all competing with each other to escape, and they crossed each other up. One scheme would blunder across another until they got their act together and had an escape committee, as it were, and cooperated.
My father had read all the First World War escape books as a young man. He very much understood what made British officers tick when they were incarcerated. There was no question that he saw his duty to escape. He tried to escape. He wanted to rejoin active combat. He wanted to get back to Britain and carry on fighting the war against the Germans. No question. Obviously, part of the process, the Germans made escape very, very difficult, and as the war progressed, this became increasingly difficult. The officers who were incarcerated decided that they would try and cause as much trouble as possible and try and get the Germans to commit as many resources as possible to keeping them in and keeping them under control. Everything was seen as part of the war effort.
I was briefed before I became a prisoner as what I should do if ever I did become a prisoner by this chap who'd written books about it. He'd been a prisoner during World War I. And he was sent round to bomber command stations to tell us what was expected of us if we became prisoners. And he said, Your duties are, number one, try to escape and rejoin the fray. Number two, cook up a code with somebody now that you think you would write to most often if you became a prisoner, so that you could send secret messages home. And I did that with my fiancée. And the third thing he said, his actual words were, your duty is to be as big a bloody nuisance as possible to the enemy.
I've never heard that, no. I knew, we all knew it was the duty, our duty to escape. I never heard his duty to create havoc. I mean, I suppose you were, it was occupying the Germans in an unpleasant way. That didn't interest me in the slightest. I was only interested in escaping.
All right, Colonel Richmond. A senior among the British have sent for you to warn you that out of Colditz there will be no escaping. The safety of your officers is in your hands. The responsibility of those who guard you is in mine. Let me emphasize it once more. The sole reward for trying to escape from Colditz will be death. Links.
But despite this ominous warning, escape was the only thing on the minds of every nationality within Colditz. However, at the beginning, there was little cooperation between the different nations in turn.
It's certainly true that in the early part of the war, when Colditz was a prisoner of war camp, there were the various nationalities had no real liaison with each other. And in fact, in some cases, some of the escapers even ignored their own senior officer or escape officer.
Right, off you go. You've got 4 minutes before they come back.
This lack of cooperation led to a number of early British attempts being abandoned mid-escape. And while all the other nations were making successful escapes or being foiled at the last minute in daring attempts, by mid-1941, the British had yet to get anyone outside.
Blasted frogs.
The British had certainly tried to escape on several occasions, either as a complete group with the canteen tunnel or as individuals. But it did appear that the other nations seemed to have more luck or more flair or whatever it was. And certainly by the middle of 1941, the British were lagging behind. The French had got some men away, for example, and then the Dutch began to get men away.
I don't think we had an inferiority complex about it. I mean, we put it down this way, we were bloody determined we were going to get out. We knew that we couldn't, most of us couldn't speak German. We knew we'd have to get out with a German speaker if you were going to get out at all. And getting out was not easy at all, bloody hard.
Bon, alors, mes amis, allons-y.
I used to think the French were so like their ruggicide, you know, such flair they had. I always think of this fellow's name I never can remember, who trotted round and then two of his mates made a sort of knee for him and threw him over the wire, and he ran off, being fired up, and ran off, jinking off, got over the wall, and just by luck, there was a bicycle there, and he bicycled all the way down to France.
With a lack of coordination in escape attempts hindering progress, it was decided to form an escape committee.
Senior officers of the various nations got together and they had a conference and said there really ought to be an escape officer for every nation, and they ought to be in regularly liaison with each other, so there aren't these problems. And that happened. And so every country that was in Colditz, every nationality had its own escape officer, and they got on very well as individuals and as a group, and that cut down the number of embarrassments.
I propose that each of us 4 senior officers appoint one of our officers to be escape officer. His duties will be to consider any ideas and suggestions regarding any proposed escapes, and to liaise with his fellow escape officers with a view to avoiding any interference, intentional or unintentional, with any particular plan.
Once all the nationalities working together, if there was a good Dutch escape scheme going, they would invite a couple of Brits in. And if we had a good one, we would invite a couple of Dutchmen in, or Frenchmen or whatever. And they had lovely forged documents saying that we were Dutch volunteered workers, and one of them was a real Dutchman, and he did all the talking. And they had travel passes, they had warrants, they had ID papers, all lovely forgeries, money, compasses, maps, silk maps. It was a different game.
With the escape committee now planning future attempts, prisoners adapted to the daily routine of life in German captivity, waiting for their opportunity to escape while routinely baiting their guards.
Well, it varied. I mean, I had the record for solitary confinement, and when I was in the cooler for 415 days total, I didn't have much of a routine. It depended what was going on. It was all dreary. It was horrible. Oh, it was ghastly.
The normal day, you'd obviously wake up, you'd make your bed, there'd be meals to prepare, although the orderlies, in those days, of course, the prisoners, the officers had orderlies who did most of the cooking. That would be done. But you've got to remember that even though Colditz was probably the place where escape was paramount, there was still lots of time to kill.
But this time to kill only fueled the ingenuity of prospective escapers. Day and night.
Okay, Pat. Right, chaps, all clear.
That's all right for some.
Aren't you happy in your work?
Don't worry, it's your turn next.
Quite likely you might be working on some escape or other, not necessarily your own. If you were lucky, you'd be working on your own. If you were clever enough to find a bloody good way out, you know. But if not, you were helping someone else. You might be doing what they call stooging, and virtually you were a sentry. And we had various things that if you were inside and watching the sentry in the yard, who'd be walking up and down with his rifle over his shoulder, you might have 3, in those days, you got your cigarettes 50 in a round tin. And you might have a tin with a yellow paper around it, or one with blue paper or something, and you had worked out beforehand that if Germans were coming in, you changed the tins over so you had a yellow tin or a blue tin on. Or else you just shouted goons up. But that's when they got really rather near you, and everyone tried to stuff away what they got, maps or making German uniforms or whatever.
Come on, give it here.
What are you doing, Lieutenant McGill? Playing squirrels?
It wasn't all escape. And they had to fill their time. So the lectures, for example, theatre was used if it wasn't out of bounds because of reprisal by the Germans for some reason. And of course exercise. These were young men, most of them, and it was very frustrating to be in this closed community, and so they played various games in the courtyard. Stool ball, which was a cross between all-in wrestling and rugby football, it seems to me, was played, and there didn't seem to be any major casualties, but it was a ferocious game with no holds barred.
Now, it was a cobbled courtyard, and you had a stool at either end of the pitch. And the idea was that you had a ball, a round ball, which is probably the same as one you played basketball with. We also had basketball there. You had to put that ball against the stool somewhere if you could. And if you did that, you'd score the equivalent of a try. But we used to tackle there just as if you were on a rugby field. I mean, there's no doubt about people, you did a flying tackle at people. And we never seemed to get hurt. You might have been a wee bit grazed and so on. And that old Douglas Bader used to do goalie and he'd sit on one of them and get knocked off and see his old tin legs up in the air, you know. But he would do that. So I think I probably enjoyed stool ball more than anything. It was great fun.
But while the prisoners might have enjoyed stool ball,
Come on, Mac, let him have it!
prison food left a lot to be desired.
Oh, the food was terrible. You had one warm meal a day. It was usually slop of some sort. And what we used to do was save a bit of that to mix it in with Red Cross food if we had any. We were supposed to get one Red Cross parcel per prisoner per week. There's never anything like it. And sometimes the delivery was erratic, and sometimes we had nothing. And it was terrible when we had no Red Cross food. The doctors reckoned that we were getting just enough calories from the German rations to exist if we lay on our beds all day and did nothing. That's what they said. And of course, when we were in solitary confinement, we weren't allowed any Red Cross food. But the boys used to save my share up for me. We all had a wonderful bash whenever I got out.
My father, who'd been to Germany before the war as a student, just on a tour around Europe, had discovered this new German coffee-making technique, which was called Melita, which was a paper filter, which you would then put your coffee into and then pour boiling hot water into, and then the coffee would filter out and it would be delicious. My father thought that the best way of utilizing the little coffee that was available from the Red Cross parcel would be to somehow recreate this coffee filter. So he took one of his socks and thought that the fine mesh and weave within the sock would contain the coffee very well, whilst allowing the boiling hot water through. So he recreated this. He put the coffee into the sock, whilst all the prisoners of war were eagerly waiting for their fresh brew. They could smell the coffee, so to speak. Unfortunately, however, when they drank the coffee, they all spat it out. It was completely undrinkable. And my poor father had failed to recognize the power of German detergents. And in fact, the socks had been washed with very powerful German detergents, and the smell and taste of detergent had completely overtaken any flavor of fresh coffee. And so he was an extremely unpopular man for a very long time as a result of this.
You had black bread, but you only got a very small slice of it. And you got German margarine, which you could put a slight film on top of it. And then you had the German prisoners' jam.
The Germans issued us with jam, which came in an enormous tins with Nur für Kriegsgefangenen written on the tin. It said for prisoners of war only. And I'm not surprised because nobody else would have eaten the bloody awful stuff. And it stained our mouths and our fingers and yuck.
I don't know what it was made out of, but was red in colour. And it did have, you might have thought there were pips in it. I think there were tiny wee bits of wood. And you smeared that on, and really that's what the Germans gave you.
We used to get a bit of use from bribing German guards. And I said this didn't ferment, it festered, this stuff. And it made what we call jam alk. And it had its effect, all right. When the Germans first caught some distillers working like two old witches in the night, you know, the witches, when shall we three meet again, with their their little still going. The Germans found them, and the commandant came in, and he saw this. They were very pleased they'd found a still, which was forbidden to do, you see. And he said, "Geben Sie mich ein Tasse." They gave, and he gave, tasted. Jauche, he said. Nobody knew what Jauche was, but that became the name of that booze, that terrible stuff. Jauche is the stuff that drains out of a cow shed. The cows are standing piddling into a trough, and that's Jauche.
With such grim conditions to exist in, the urge to escape grew stronger.
There he comes, dead on time, bless him.
Links!
It led to the British concocting one of the most daring attempts of the whole war.
Ostenbereich von hier bis zum Sportfeld.
Voice production good, strength 5.
Auf Gefangenen, die zu fliehen versuchen, ist sofort zu schießen.
We need to get a copy of that dialogue.
I've got one, sir.
Good. I'll have to understand it, even if the censor doesn't.
Wache, Marsch! Links.
Franz Josef, as the prisoners called him, he was a sergeant major, Rothenberger, with a very big, bushy moustache, which looked like Franz Josef, one of the previous leaders of Germany.
Well, I'll be Franz Josef.
Well, I could be. I'll make a boy start work on me.
Mike Sinclair spent a long time, weeks and weeks, studying this rather elderly German NCO. And they decided that they would impersonate him. A remarkable thing to do, really, in a small camp where people are known. So they carefully studied how he talked, how he carried himself, his build, and it was Mike Sinclair who impersonated him.
Mike Sinclair dressed up as Franz Josef, and then he had some German speakers dressed up as German sentries. And the idea was to relieve the German sentries with British sentries, and then the whole lot of us, not the whole lot, but a number of us, get out and be marched off, you know, and then bugger off once we got out into the countryside.
The film depicts the escape being attempted by Colonel Richmond instead of Mike Sinclair. But Mike Sinclair was the perfect impersonator.
He was Franz Josef when we saw him. Mike Sinclair had it absolutely. He looked just like Franz Josef. And of course, he lived for escaping. I mean, more than any of us. You know, you'd wake up at night, and if you happened to be in the same room, I wasn't, but friends of mine told me, and he'd be at the window 3 o'clock in the morning watching a sentry and timing him and so on. He was determined he was going to escape.
The idea was that they would be lowered out of a window on the other side of the castle. They would march round and try and relieve 2 sentries, one on a catwalk and one on the ground. Relieve those 2, saying there'd been special orders from the guardhouse that they needed back in the guardhouse. And it would be, of course, Rothenberger who would do the ordering. That would leave an area of the castle completely unguarded, and it was hoped to get men away from a second-story window, and it would be a mass escape.
Watching on, waiting for his chance to flee the castle that night, was Coron Purdon.
I've forgotten whether it was the hospital or somewhere, or the French quarters. We hung around there, hoping to, you know, go out. And I can't remember whether, I know I had a bloody awful civilian jacket, which was too tight round my shoulders, and I was going to wear that.
Kommen Sie mit.
Good God, it's going to work.
Well, the first part went very well. And Franz Josef, the dummy Franz Josef, and the two prisoners, dressed as German guards, walked past at least 2 sentries who sort of stood to attention. They got to the wire fence and the gate and the catwalk, and Mike Sinclair, who spoke nearly perfect German, persuaded one of the guards to leave. The other one refused to go. And he demanded to see his ID card, and Mike Sinclair handed it over, and there were mistakes. There were 2 mistakes on it. And the sentry pressed a button, and the riot squad arrived.
Merging escapes again, the film incorporates Pat Reid tunnelling under the walls to emerge via a trapdoor covered in grass as the Franz Josef diversion takes place elsewhere. But sadly, the result for both escapes is the same.
Get back!
Then a shot ran out. And Mike Sinclair fell to his knees, and he survived a pistol shot from about a yard.
I think he was shot through, certainly shot through the chest. And of course then everyone shouted out murderer and so on at them. And no, that was a shame. That could have been a wonderful escape.
Another escape had been unsuccessful, and those involved were hauled up in front of the camp commandant.
It must be clearly understood that here in Colditz, these ridiculous attempts will not be tolerated.
But it was probably the most daring escape in some ways of the whole time in Colditz. Audacious, certainly.
But the British weren't to be deterred. They were determined to escape and used all manner of homemade tools and smuggled equipment to try to break free.
Come on, Pat, get a move on.
We got a certain amount of stuff sent from, I wish I could remember the name of the bloody place. There was a place, Licensed Victualers, I think it was called, and they used to send maps and money in sets of games and gramophone records, you know, under the label of them and so on. Chaps used to make their own, and they'd make their own hacksaws. You see, these fellows were so clever. I mean, they would make a hacksaw and they would take a bit off the end of a bed and make some metal implement out of it. They made their own camera, some of these chaps, which they used with, I think, spec lenses. I'm not sure. I'm not clever enough to know about that, but a lot of the stuff was actually made in the camp by these chaps. You know, dummy keys and things like that. They could make them. I don't know how the hell they did, but they could.
MI9, Military Intelligence 9 in Britain, got its act together and began to smuggle things in. They were maps inside the covers of books. I've got some books that arrived sent to me with the covers slashed open by the Germans to see what was in there. And all sorts of little tricks. Very, very clever.
Tunnelling, for example, of course, required literally knives and crowbars, if they could get them. Now, these were constructed, actually made by the prisoners. Certainly, when a lorry came in on one occasion, certain parts of the lorry equipment was taken, which helped with tunnelling. And with people impersonating people, they literally spent hours and hours making uniforms and dummy rifles and caps.
For the love of Mike, what's happening?
Oh, merde, allons-y.
Right.
Escapes were becoming ever more desperate and spontaneous. And there was always the risk of a traitor in the midst or loose talk compromising escapes.
Let Harry know we're coming.
So many things were done on a need-to-know basis, which was very sensible. We had to be very careful, for example, with the French community right in the beginning, because some of those were a bit sympathetic towards the Vichy government. And you had to watch out that people didn't hear things that they could talk about carelessly and be picked up on maybe on hidden microphones, for example. So we had to keep our lips shut.
Prisoners eventually got out of Colditz using all manner of methods, often by the simple combination of distraction and making use of a sudden opportunity.
Italian present, sir. Would you like to carry on?
Thank you, Captain Tyler.
Thank you, sir.
But there was also the intricate, more carefully planned, and some might say bizarre attempts to escape.
They're the guards. No soldiers in the world can drill like the guards. Halt! Turn to the left and fall out in quick time. Yes! Halt!
I remember a chap called Beaumont, John Beaumont, I think he was called. He became a padre later on. And he made himself a sort of sheet and he fixed onto it empty tins and tin lids and bits of paper and so on. In other words, so that it looked like a sort of rubbish dump in a way. And he carried that with him when we went down to the Tiergarten. And on the way, he just dropped on the ground and put it over him. And so the guards didn't notice him doing that, and there was just this heap of tins and paper on the side of the road. He did actually get picked up, I think purely a dog. I think one of the police dogs got him there. But that was the sort of thing. People were trying to do opportune escapes.
And any escape had to be covered up. A missing prisoner had to be accounted for. To do this, the Allies devised the rabbit.
You see, we were in 5 ranks, you see, covering off. And to count us, they'd have one German in the front, one in the back, and they would in the back, and they would go down 15, 20, counting us in 5s. Well, if you had a chap in the rear rank, a little fella, he could be counted and then bob down and run down the ranks and pop up down there. And then he'd go one extra prisoner.
You also have to remember that the nationalities, their escapes reflected their own characteristics, I think. The French loved dash and élan, so vaulting over a wire and zigzagging away was their ideal escape, like Marais-le-Brun, for example. They thought that was wonderful. The Dutch were very clever. They got inside the Germans' minds and looked at it from their point of view and realised where the weaknesses were. And perhaps the Brits were a bit sort of, charge in with all guns blazing. Perhaps it lacked a bit of subtlety early on. But because the various nations swapped ideas and escaped as groups, there's a sort of cross-fertilisation of ideas and methods, and the British began to catch up, and catch up pretty quickly, actually.
Getting outside Colditz was one thing. getting back to Britain without being recaptured was something else entirely. Many an escapee was returned after being on the run for days or even weeks.
All the things I didn't want to see. 14 days on the run.
Well, there were three parts to an escape. One was getting out of the castle, two was getting across Germany, and three was getting into neutral territory. Many prisoners, of course, were recaptured either in the act of escaping or, having got out, recaptured in the Third Reich. Some got away for not days, but even weeks.
It didn't affect morale. It just made people right. Well, we'll find. Okay, we'll learn from that bloody one, and we'll do it better next time.
And the prisoners had a nice little habit of when they were brought back in, they were clapped, and the length of time it took of the clap was the length of time they'd been out. So if this chap had been out for a few hours, it was just a derisory clap, but if they'd been out for several days, it was a longer clap. So that was rather nice, or rather cynical, if you like.
Oh, actually, everybody was sorry for the poor chap, you know. But I can't say that the morale went up and down. It didn't. I mean, it was all part of the game, wasn't it?
Morale was always high there, always high. It really was. It was very, very high. And you know, Germans used to get so annoyed. We'd always tell them, you know, we're going to win this bloody war. You know, we are going to win. You're going to be beaten. And no one ever. And we knew we would. Of course, we do. We British, we always win in the end. And we knew we bloody well would.
Every time a prisoner came back, he could add information about what was happening in the Third Reich, what places to avoid, what things to do to avoid being captured, and what not to do. So this was all logged away. So it wasn't totally wasted. And actually, to get out of the camp was considered to be, you know, something quite an achievement. But the object was to get home, of course. So you had gonaways, which was getting out of the camp, and the home run, which was the most cherished, of course, of all.
Haven't got an escape on, have you, sir?
No, I wish we had. Well, what's the trouble?
I've got a wonderful idea, sir.
I see. What about?
For an escape. Can't fail.
None of them can till they do.
Determined to achieve a home run, the theatre within Colditz provided the inspiration for the next British escape.
Listen, Pat. The German mess is on the first floor here.
Right.
The floor above that is used as officers' quarters.
Check.
The floor above that isn't used at all. And the floor above that is the theatre. This theatre. That means that from the disused storeroom under here, there's bound to be a staircase leading past the mess, right down to that slice of strength-through joy standing over there. Pat, do you realize that if we could look under this stage 3 floors down, we'd see a lot of little Jerry Sabletons all reading La Vie Parisienne? Well, Pat?
It's extraordinary that we had the use of a rather swish theatre with things around the walls, little coats of arms or what do you know, what do you call them, with the names of great actors or writers or whatever, or musicians. There were some that had all been defaced because they were Jewish, for goodness sake. And we had the use of this theatre for our own productions, so long as we behaved ourselves. But it was something that the Germans could take away from us. And I didn't like that. The only reason they let us have it was it could punish us by stopping us from using it.
But in January 1942, this theatre was the perfect distraction as the British put on one of their variety shows. As the crowds gathered, a number of escapees made their way to lurk in the wings. Among them in the film is Pat Reid, but in reality, he was simply one of the helpers on this escape and didn't get out himself. With German uniforms under their prison clothes, the anxious escapees made their way beneath the stage.
All clear.
I was in a couple or three productions in the beginning with a professional producer. He was a territorial army officer. But after a while, I was not allowed in any of these productions because they could never rely on me being available when the curtain went up. I was always in the cooler.
Lowering themselves into an unused area from beneath the stage, the escapees switch uniforms before continuing their daring bid for freedom.
How you die? Good luck. We don't want to see you back. Get home in one piece. Bye.
The escape under the theatre was slightly twisted in the film because, of course, 4 got away, I think, including Pat Reid, whereas, of course, it was only 2, followed by another 2 a few days later, and the first pair, of course, included Airy Neve. But it was one of the great escapes from Colditz, and it was conceived by Pat Reid, and the film is pretty accurate, to be honest, on that escape, except for the numbers involved on the day.
After travelling through France, Spain and Gibraltar, Airy Neve finally arrived back in Britain to become the first British officer from Colditz to make a home run. The British had breached Colditz.
News got through eventually to the prisoners that he'd done it, and that raised morale dramatically with the British. It could be done. It actually could be done. Not only to get out of the castle, to get across all of occupied Europe, and to get back to Britain. And after that, escaping was given a big impetus, and of course it led eventually to Pat Reid and 3 others getting away. I mean, that was the biggest single escape from Colditz. To get home, 4 of them. I like to think that it's rather neat that they were from the RAF, the Army, and the Royal Navy.
Before I call on you to return to your own quarters, I have a piece of news for you, gentlemen. A postcard from 2 aunts of mine. I had intended to keep it until the morning, but now we find ourselves gathered together. This seems as good an opportunity as any to give it you. Dearest Guy, we are both very well and enjoying the refreshing Swiss air. How we wish you could be with us. Your loving aunts, Gert and Daisy. They're perhaps better known to you as Pat Reid and Jimmy Winslow.
Pat Reid escaped in October 1942, one of 15 home runs made during the Second World War. But for some, there is no escape from Colditz, and the memories remain.
I wish I could forget them, but I can't. I lie awake very often at night still thinking about it.
Well, it probably did me good, I suppose. I don't know, in some way. Terribly frustrating. I mean, I was a regular soldier. Before the war, I was the last lot out of Sandhurst. I wanted to get back to my commander, and I wanted to get back to my fiancée, quite honestly.
And what of the man who brought Colditz to the attention of the world? How did he reflect on his time there?
He said himself that he would never, ever, ever wish to have that experience again. And he is on record for saying that, and which is totally understandable. On the other hand, with the benefit of hindsight, it was an important part of his life. It gave him his wife, his family. It gave him a more interesting dimension, maybe to his character. And from that point of view, it can't all have been negative. I think it was very much a situation of where you draw positives from a negative experience. And of course, most importantly, he made a lot of very, very good friends. Some of his Colditz friends were friends of his right to the end of his life.